Astarion primped and preened as much as he could without a mirror to go by, or even his shadow cast on the back of his tent. He told himself that he was flawless, of course, but he knew in the back of his mind that he didn't have any margin for error. Simon could be seduced, yes, but he couldn't go giving away the milk. And at the same time, nobles were fickle, and Simon clearly had eyes for Gale as well. Ugh. Perhaps he didn't have to try this hard to seduce him. Astarion listened for the approach of Simon's boots, his stride long but light. His elven legacy, he would surely say, as if he hadn't been trained to balance a book on his head while wandering the halls of his country house. Simon quietly pushed the flap of Astarion's tent aside to find him lying amongst the pillows, arrayed as though he were a painter's model, his shirt collar undone, his hair tousled, his trousers riding low on his hips. Gods, if Simon hadn't already made his sacrifice for the night. "Good evening, darling," Astarion purred. "I wasn't expecting room service tonight." He chuckled lowly, his eyes smoldering in the dark of his tent. A little shaft of firelight fell on his cheek, across his throat, pouring down his chest like molten gold. Perfectly posed. How was he such a pretty liar? "I'm taking last watch. I didn't want to make you wait," Simon began, sinking to his knees at Astarion's side. It was a struggle to keep his mind focused. He could have his fantasies later of, what if you stayed tonight? What if you hooked your thumb into Astarion's trousers? What if Astarion pushed you back into the cushions and took you, his hand over your mouth and his fangs in your neck? What if... How thoughtful. Astarion smirked, his gaze flicking down to Simon's neck hungrily. He reached up to gently pull the collar of Simon's shirt aside, exposing his favorite patch of skin to bite. Besides the one on the other side, of course. Astarion sat up, mouth open, but hesitated at the last moment. "May I?" he asked with a soft chuckle. "Of course," Simon replied. "But do try not to take as much as you did last night. I have duties." "Ah, of course. I got carried away last night. I do apologize. But no harm done, Right," Simon murmured. He adjusted his position, leaning forward and bracing himself over Astarion, his gaze fixed forward and his cheeks warm. Astarion leaned closer, his cool breath washing across Simon's neck. He smelled clean, of soap and parchment. Probably how he usually smelled. It was still enticing, and the sound of his beating heart underscored his scent, that strong and steady song of life. Oh, he could get used to this. Astarion bit down as gently as he could, keenly aware that some of the others may still be up and about. No need to scandalize them. Not over just a bite, anyway. Simon let out a little hitched sound as fangs pierced his neck, the tiny sliver of pain quickly fading. It was almost a disappointment how quickly the pain left, but the pleasure that followed was hypnotic. He supposed vampire bites would have to be pleasurable, or else it would be awfully hard to tempt mortals into their grasp. He tempted you before he'd bitten you at all. All right, perhaps that was true, but he kept coming back for more. More bites, more bloodletting, more of the tender touch of Astarion's lips against his flesh. Simon sighed softly before hurriedly covering his mouth, cheeks hot. This wasn't supposed to be erotic. This was a simple exchange, blood for strength, a transaction, an agreement for survival. Yes. Then why does he whisper such sweet nothings? Use that tone. Sigh and moan like that as he drinks. He's clearly enjoying this. It was good for him last night. Last night had been good for Simon, too, though he dared not say it aloud. His thoughts drifted to one of the last times he'd laid in the lap of another man. Gods, how long it had been. There'd been no clothes that time, of course. Nothing stopping him from just turning his head, and Astarion's fingers slid up the column of Simon's neck and carded into his dark hair with a lover's knowing touch, and Simon pulled back with a gasp. That's... He panted, trembling slightly. Too much? Astarion asked, blood trickling from his lips decadently. Yes, Simon stammered. It had been many years since he could have been said to have a lover, since anyone had tried to hold him like that. He longed for it, to be held, but... He reached up to touch the wounds on his neck, hot blood still flowing. Astarion was there in an instant, surging forward and sealing his lips securely around the dripping bite marks once more. His warm tongue ran along the sinew of Simon's neck as he caught the steady flow, a pleased sigh leaving him. As desperately as he wanted to try to snare the rabbit in front of him, he had to be patient, apparently. Astarion kept his hands to himself, even as every fiber of his being and every drop of Simon inside him urged him to run his hands along the younger man's back, to lay down between Simon's long legs and take him in his arms and drink. No. Patience. Control yourself. No sense killing the golden goose. Besides, he thinks you're a gentleman. Astarion reluctantly pressed his lips against the wounds to stem the flow, denying himself the further rich sweetness of Simon's blood. Not too much, he'd agreed. Be a gentleman for a little while longer. Simon trembled softly and let out a shaky little sigh as he felt Astarion finish for the evening, his pale lips stained red, his pallid cheeks now flush with Simon's blood as he pulled away with a deeply pleased sigh. "Shall I get something for that?" Astarion asked, his gaze flicking down to the open wounds. "Oh, no. I'll take care of it when I go back to bed," Simon murmured, his eyes sliding closed. He always felt a little dizzy after Astarion fed, and knew standing would only exacerbate the problem. "I see. And when were you planning on going back to bed?" Astarion asked, smirking and leaning close. His heart beat so strongly in his chest. The heat was electric in his fingertips. He could smell the willowy scent of Simon's arousal just as surely as he smelled his own. Every time he fed from Simon, he felt that lingering heat in his loins, and every time he'd had to satisfy it elsewhere. Perhaps it wasn't too late to snare him tonight. They could both get what they wanted. Simon turned away coyly, a little smile on his plush lips, and for one blood-drunk moment Astarion wondered how those lips would look wrapped around his. Simon jumped at a soft sound just outside the tent, followed by what sounded like a struggle. Eyes wide, he pushed open the flap of Astarion's tent and clambered out, his head swimming for a moment from the blood loss. Not 10 feet away, Shadowheart had pinned Lae'zel to the ground in her bedroll, a dagger held to her throat. "You had every chance to look the other way, but here we are." "You chose this," Shadowheart whispered in the dark. "Spare me the justifications, coward!" Lae'zel spat, glaring up past the steel. "If anyone asks, I'll say you were transforming. Don't expect to be mourned." "Shadowheart!" Simon whispered harshly, not wanting to wake the others. "What in the hells do you think you're doing?" "Simon!" Shadowheart gave a start, but did not release her pin on Lae'zel. Her gaze flicked from Simon's face to the fresh bite marks on his neck, the blood that had seeped into the collar of his nightshirt. She'd wondered why his bedroll was empty on the sneak over here, but knew she ought not be surprised.
She's a liability. It's the artifact we need, not her.
Let me up and I'll show you, Lae'zel growled. We need her to get into the creche. Unless this artifact can remove tadpoles and fight, it's not more useful to us than Lae'zel. Or us to her, Simon reasoned, his gaze flicking down to Lae'zel on the ground. We work together or we die apart, remember? Now come away from her, Simon said, disapproval heavy in his voice.
Can I trust I can turn my back on her? Shadowheart sniped.
If you can't, whose fault is that? You held a dagger to her throat. You sounded so confident when you agreed to the duel, but you tried to end her in her sleep. I'm disappointed in you, Shadowheart. You needn't act like a scared child lost in the woods. Simon noticed a spark of recognition flicker across Shadowheart's face, but she said nothing. Lae'zel, with me, if you please, Simon said, looking at the woman on the ground. And Shadowheart, go to bed. You have a big morning tomorrow, don't you? He sighed, brow furrowed. He shouldn't have needed to keep using that parental tone with two grown women, but by the gods, if they were going to continue acting like children, he felt entitled to be disappointed in their behavior. Huffing, Shadowheart backed off, but did not stow her dagger. That Istik has no honor, Lae'zel growled, her wiry body coiled like a spring after such an awakening. We won't get anywhere calling one another names, Simon scolded. Though I agree, it was not honorable. I wish you didn't think you could find honor in this duel tomorrow, he added softly, slowly beginning to walk the perimeter of camp with her. Honor comes through battle. Honor comes through your conduct, Simon frowned. You don't think Shadowheart will suddenly be honorable if she fights you, do you? Or a mind flayer? The way Lae'zel's gaze narrowed answered his question. I understand, though. You wish to settle the disagreement in a structured way, a legalistic way, even if it is not the laws of our lands, Simon sighed. But I implore you, Lae'zel, find honor in your conduct. Be the bigger woman. Forfeit the fight. Surrender! I would rather die, Lae'zel hissed. Not surrendering, no. You said that either party can forfeit in trial by combat at any time, yes? Forfeit the duel as soon as it begins. It may not be as satisfactory as drawing blood, but it is still honorable. Chuck! More to the point, if Shadowheart retains the artifact, I'm not about to let her run off to Baldur's Gate alone with it. Nor would I let you go off with it alone either. That's a fine way to end up dead with her reclaiming the artifact from your corpse. If you forfeit the match to her, then you can still keep an eye on it, and you may curry favor enough through such an act for her to let you examine the object. See if you can make any sense of it. I see your logic, Lae'zel frowned, but I do not like it. I'm not asking you to be happy with the logic, merely to accept it. Simon sighed, looking up at the bright face of Selûne in the sky, the trail of meteors following after. Lae'zel slowed her pace and stood next to him, gazing up at the moon with a hint of wistfulness in her gaze. That is my home, Lae'zel remarked softly, following his gaze. Creche Kalir is among the tears of Selûne, rocky bodies spanning the sea of night. There we would look up into the sky just like this and see Toriel, never moving, but its face constantly changing. It was a lesson to us, to expect conditions to change at any moment, to find a fixed point to navigate by, to endure the cold and dark when Toriel eclipsed the sun from us. It was a goal for us to conquer one day, and a place I never thought I would see, she added. There were enough monsters and enemies to slay in the tunnels and space between the tiers that descending to the surface was never a priority. And now that you're here? Simon asked after a long moment, smiling slightly as they paused on the pebbly riverbank.
Now that I'm here, I find it to be a hard world full of soft beings. The lessons Toriel taught us in Creche Kalir would be wisely learned here. They are always on my mind, always applied.
She turned to look at him, her golden eyes dilated in the dark of the night.
I shall endure.
Thank you. Simon smiled wider. Although, speaking of creches, what did you learn about this one?
The Tiefling told us it was to the northwest. A red dragon has been sighted in the area, a Githyanki warrior's mount. Why are you laughing?
Lae'zel asked, narrowing her gaze. Did you say tiefling? Simon asked, grinning.
That is what the horned ones are called, correct?
Tiefling, Simon pronounced, with a f. The dark of the night hid the slight flush of embarrassment she could feel creeping into the edges of her ears, and she merely huffed in annoyance.
Your language is soft, much like the people here,
she remarked, crossing her arms.
Regardless, he did not see the creche, merely Githyanki, who no doubt are being raised there. If he had met a seasoned warrior, he would not have lived to tell the tale. Perhaps Toriel breeds soft Gith just as it breeds soft people. And soft sounds, she added, emphasizing the F with a bit of an exaggerated curl of her upper lip. Out for a late night stroll? Simon turned to find Karlak approaching them with her usual easy smile. You ought to hit the hay. Big day tomorrow. You all right? Karlak asked and glanced over at Lae'zel, her expression souring slightly after the events of the day. In spite of certain attempts, I am still in good health. The tadpole aside, of course.
Too right. Karlak's face split into a grin. She tossed her head back with a laugh, a heavy fang earring swinging wildly and catching Simon's eye for a moment. Nevertheless, you should get to bed. In fact, we should all get to bed. Simon sighed, raising a hand to his temple before subtly checking the fresh bite on his neck. Still dripping. Astarion would be disappointed at the waste. Lae'zel turned on her heel and strode back to her bedroll, and Karlak continued on her rounds, leaving Simon standing along the riverbank, the chill of night beginning to slice through the lingering heat of the day. He turned to find that healing potion he'd said he'd drink, but paused for a moment beside the strangest of their lot. Withers sat at a makeshift desk, held up at one end with stones and a few books, a pen and inkwell to his right, and an ever-lengthening scroll spilling over the beaten edge of the table. Simon peered at the scroll in the dark for a moment, but the campfire provided too much backlight. The face of the page was completely shrouded by darkness even his elven eyes couldn't clearly focus through. Tread cautiously, Withers advised, his voice raspy with eons of dust in his throat. Thou art gambling with lives, a wager thou might not be willing to pay. Simon straightened up a bit, but kept his head bowed. It's not my first time gambling with lives, Your Holiness, he murmured. You asked me once, what is the value of a single mortal life? I think it is always valuable. But when comparing one to another, which is more valuable can change in an instant. All you can hope is to stay ahead of the game. In this game, thou knowest not the day the debt will be collected, but thou knowest always that it shall be collected. Take care thou dost not find thyself short. Lucky we have an in with the house, eh? Simon winked. Good night, sir, he said, bowing deeply and returning to his bedroll. Simon sighed quietly and chewed the inside of his lip. He just had to put in an appearance. Make nice with the in-laws. Smile when Mother spoke. He paused outside the parlor and smoothed his hair and cravat in the distorted reflection of an obsidian vase, the lilies there, his namesake, bending their pale heads over his own and weeping their perfume over him. Be strong. Hold your head up. You are the portrait of a strong elven man. Ha! Ha 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 ha! He took a steadying breath and stepped forward, just in view past the entryway, and waited to be summoned in. Well, I must say, the yoke of marriage sits well on his shoulders, narrow as they may be, the Dowager Baroness Fontdale said, holding her tea daintily. She was an aged human woman of about 70, with iron-gray hair and eyes to match. Everything about her gave the impression of hardened steel, rigid, sharp, cold, unyielding. So long as they're not unequally yoked, of course, Delora, his father-in-law replied, his back ramrod straight and tension filling every limb. He had dark brown hair and a Water-Davian-inspired coif, and a thick mustache which bristled with his nervous laughter. Simon estimated him to only be a few years older than himself. How the years treated elves and humans so differently. Oh, Lord Van de Vries, she tittered in return, though her lips curled in a sneer at his overly familiar use of her name. Remind me, what is your full title? Van de Vries' laughter faltered as he met her cold grey gaze over her teacup, sensing he had misstepped somehow. Just Lord Van de Vries, my lady. Indeed. Don't ever forget, you sought for your daughters to be unequally yoked. My boy's shoulders may be narrow, but noble blood drives a deep furrow. I do hope darling Cordelia can keep up in my fields. It was all Lord Van de Vries could do to keep himself from pointing out that no one had furrowed her fields in over 50 years. Such a quip would surely earn reprisal from that drow butler that the White Lilies kept. He couldn't see where he was lurking, but his presence filled the room with the skin-prickling feeling of threat. Ah, Simon, the Dowager Baroness called with a simpering smile, finally acknowledging Simon's presence in his own home. Good of you to join us. Sit, she ordered. Her tone was pleasant but sharp, as one would speak to a hunting dog. Yes, mother, Simon replied automatically, sweeping the tails of his coat aside as he perched on the edge of the winged-backed chair beside her like a great black heron, neck arched and chest bold. He kept his gaze focused on her. Though he was the Baron Fontdale, it was to be made clear at all times who held the true power in the room. He ground his teeth behind his smile. Mistress Dorvir, tea, she called. You know how my son takes it. Yes, my lady. A reedy voice replied as a man materialized out of the shadows. A drow man, short and compact and covered in scars, but drawn to his full height in his finely trimmed service uniform, he still seemed an impressive presence. The only person in the room who seemed more in command of the space was the Dowager Baroness herself. He poured the tea in full view of the room, and dropped in a single lump of sugar before sliding a slice of lemon into the cup. Simon, however, caught sight of the second lump that he slipped in right under the Dowager Baroness's nose. Thank you, Estorvia, Simon said in his most off-handed tone. Forgive me, but what were we discussing? We were just talking about how Cordelia has been settling in at Silver Spring, the Dowager Baroness said, looking between Lord Van de Vries and Simon, calculating. Ah, yes. I think the fresh air and change of pace in the countryside is doing her well. Proper gardens and natural beauty are balms for those who are unhappy in the city, Simon remarked, stirring his tea without letting the spoon touch the porcelain. Good, good. Lord Van de Vries cleared his throat, flashing a dazzling merchant's smile at his family-in-law, all looking down their noses at him in the way that only landed nobility could. Even their butler could barely restrain his sneer. "Hopefully we shall see the fruits of this change of pace soon, eh?" "Pardon?" Simon asked, raising a well-kept brow. "Well, you've been wed for nearly a year now, and there's no heir as of yet," Lord Vandervries said, his brows twitching together slightly. "Not even word of a quickening. There's no trouble, is there?" "No trouble at all, I assure you," Simon replied coolly. "Certainly none that I should desire your assistance with." "Simon," the Dowager Baroness toned, her spoon scraping the side of her cup harshly, "it is time to discuss this matter." "Mother, please," Simon pleaded, looking down into his teacup. "Do I detect a rebuke, boy?" "No, ma'am. It's only that matters between a husband and wife are private," Simon murmured, his voice growing softer as he addressed her directly. "Will you excuse us, please, Lord Vandervries? I do apologize." The Dowager Baroness told rather than asked, her tone crisp as new-fallen snow in the night. "Mr. Storvie, see him out." The drow was at Lord Vandervries's elbow immediately, his garnet gaze smouldering as he waited to escort the men the few short feet out of the parlor. As he left, Vandervries caught the eye of his son-in-law for the briefest moment. His wide, pleading gaze in that moment reminded Vandervries that he was quite young indeed for an elf. As soon as the door to the parlor was shut, the Baroness boiled over. "You sleep in separate beds. Are you husband and wife, or aren't you?" she snapped. "You do understand how babies are made, don't you? That the man doesn't put his face in the pillows for that?" "Yes, mother," Simon answered immediately. "And how dare you presume to lecture me on relations between a husband and wife? Do you think yourself so much better than I for being wed? Do you think you would even have a wife if I hadn't brought her to you, gift-wrapped and tagged, so even an idiot like you couldn't mistake it? And to forget yourself twice in not only my presence, but the presence of company? Has our Lord taken all your senses?" He barely had time to reply, "No, mother," between her lashings. "I'm not going to be around forever to wipe for you, you know. Not with the strain you put on my nerves. I'm liable to be dead of an aneurysm before you can manage to properly sow your seed, and God's help us all in that case. Tell me you know us from Quim, boy." "Yes, mother, I do," he whispered, his ears burning with embarrassment all the way to their pointed tips. "Tell me." "I know us from Quim, ma'am," he said, swallowing desperately. "Good. Now prove it. I had better hear you doing your duty tonight, or Lord help me, I'll find someone to do it for you. It wouldn't be the first time a bastard became Baron Fontdale now, would it?" "No, ma'am," Simon whimpered, squeezing his eyes shut for a moment before forcing them back open. "And wash out that filthy mouth of yours. Do you praise our Lord with such lips? Can he hope to speak with such a disgusting mouth? Out of my sight, boy." "Yes, mother," Simon said quickly, setting his tea aside untouched and rising from his seat. "Oh, my dress!" the Baroness cried, looking down at where her tea had sloshed in her fury. "Clean it! Take some responsibility, boy." "I'm terribly sorry, mother," Simon said with arcane control, falling genuflect and pulling vibrating threads of the weave over the stain in her dress, lifting the soil with effortless casting. The tea seemed to boil away from where the droplets lifted into the air, evaporating with a pleasant, light scent. The Baroness was unimpressed. "Sorry doesn't clean dresses, or sire heirs. Go," she ordered, "and do try to be a man for once. I was told I have a son." Will frowned a bit as he came back from his rounds to find Simon squirming in his bedroll, muttering and mumbling in his sleep. He glanced around first. Nobody else was awake save for Withers, and Astarion wasn't back from hunting yet. It was all on him. He sheathed his rapier and knelt down next to Simon, reaching out to gently shake his shoulder. As he came close, his tadpole latched onto the thought forms clouding Simon's mind. Harsh, cold, towering, bitter. "Hey, Simon, you're having a nightmare. Wake up," he called softly. "Come on, snap out of it." Simon was slow to open his eyes, and when he did, his vision was blurred with fatigue and tears. Will? He sat up in bed and hurriedly wiped at his eyes and cheeks, the burn of shame spreading there as he woke. I'm sorry. Terribly sorry. Did I disturb you? I'm sorry, he whispered. Not at all. Nightmares? He asked, shifting to half-sit at Simon's side. Simon swallowed with difficulty and nodded, averting his gaze. Won't talk about it? No. Yes? I don't know. Simon sighed, turning back to Will. How's your relationship with your parents? He ventured, drawing his long legs up to his chest and hugging them close. We lost Mum when I was born, so it was just me and my father for my whole life growing up. There was a portrait of her in Father's room. She had a kind face, and I'm told a lovely voice. Good for lullabies, Will said. You? Simon shook his head, his face hidden in his knees. I never met my father. And my mother is a very trying woman. You're doing courtly talk again, Will said, giving him a little nudge. Say what you really mean, what you wanted to say. I dare not. She's my mother, Simon whispered, a green eye peering out from the crook of his arm. And you still love her? Will ventured, though if he was any good at mathematics, he could put two and two together from what had leaked into his mind from that nightmare. No, Simon answered quickly, taking a rattling breath. I know she can't hear me, but even still, He breathed through his nose like a furious bull, but his small, curled form was far less intimidating. I want to scream, but that would disturb the peace of the camp, Simon said after a moment, trying to compose himself. Oh, I've got something for that. Will smiled, rocking back up onto his feet effortlessly and digging through one of the many boxes and chests around the campsite. He withdrew a furled scroll and broke the wax seal on it, holding it up for Simon to read. Shouldn't we save that? Simon asked, shifting uncomfortably at the idea of using their spoils and resources so frivolously. For what, a holiday? Using it on an enemy means you'd probably get caught too. Best to use it when we need it. And I think you need it, Will said, his voice warm and sympathetic. You'll have 10 minutes if this scroll's to be believed. Will's eyes shone with dark fire as he reached for his threads of the weave. Silencio, he decreed. He only heard the burning of the stored magic in the scroll for a moment before a bubble of perfect, complete silence enveloped them, along with most of the camp. The crackle of the campfire, the soft breathing of their companions, the chirp of insects in the trees and reeds beyond, the calming sound of the little waterfall, were all instantly eliminated. Simon could feel his pulse, but couldn't hear the blood rushing in his ears like he normally could in even the quietest caves deep in the temple. This was the quiet of the grave, a silence that Simon had experienced before, in the deepest embrace of Hadar. He looked up and saw Will's mouth moving, and then a bemused smile coming over him before finally gesturing to Simon. Will, for his part, had always been intrigued by magical silence. It was a devilishly sly little trick to be able to pull. Being able to shut Mizora up would be a welcome skill. Damn shame she'd never offer him that sort of magic. He continued to experiment for a moment, raising his hands and attempting to call magic forth. He could feel the anticipation in the weave as he performed the intricate hand motions necessary. But without the energy of speech, it dissipated in disappointment, like watching a pretty face turn away at a party. Motion caught his eye, and he looked back at Simon, who was pounding his fists against his temples, his mouth open wide in a silent, primal scream. He pulled at his own hair, tears pouring down his cheeks as he threw his head back and sobbed to the stars, his mouth forming words that Will was quite certain would make even a sailor take pause. Flickers of arcane energy flashed his ominous blue-green in his eyes, and for a strange moment, Will could swear he felt the gravity shift around them as a pitiless dark star made itself known to him somewhere above. Cold, dying, oddly familiar. The sun painted the tops of the trees and mountains with soft pinks and golds, and the morning mist that rose along the riverbank shone silver. Dewdrops on cattails and spiderwebs glittered like diamonds, and birds sang an angelic chorus. Simon wasn't often awake to greet the dawn, but as the world bestowed royal finery upon his shoulders, he knew he would have to change that. It was little wonder the most popular aspect of the sun was the Morning Lord. A soft stirring from the edge of camp drew Simon's attention, and his green gaze searched the tree line, his staff at the ready. His foresight only bade him relax a moment before the figure came into view. Astarion, back from his hunt, and covered in blood and bruises. Astarion? Oh, good morning, my lord. Astarion slurred, his steps weaving as he approached Simon, a wide grin on his face. I was just wondering where you were. Right where I've been all morning. At your service, Your Honor, Simon replied, his brow furrowed slightly. Was he drunk? Are you now? Don't make promises you can't keep, darling. Astarion laughed, bumping into Simon and causing them both to stumble. Though your services always do wonders for me, he grinned, leaning against him. I caught a bear this morning, thanks to you. It looks like you caught vice versa, Simon stated, twisting his fingers above the blood and dirt stains on Astarion's fine silk shirt and lifting them away with a tug of magic. Oh, yes. He took a little of my blood, and I took all of his, Astarion smirked. Couldn't have done it without your little gift earlier. Blood is blood, isn't it? Oh, don't sell yourself short, darling. You're comparing tavern clock to vintage wine, Astarion attempted to explain. Well, I have put 5 bottles of 1436 Chateau Galvon into my body over the years, among many other fine vintages, Simon chuckled. There, see? You are what you eat, or drink, whatever. Astarion laughed, still leaning heavily into Simon. Although Cazador fed me rats and bugs, so what does that make me? He asked, his attitude immediately souring. It's only a saying, Astarion. Really? Living in the shadows, eating the refuse in the gutter? But that was the past. I'll never have to grovel and scrape before him again, Astarion said with a heavy, satisfied sigh, dropping his head against Simon's shoulder. Indeed, Simon replied, trying a different tactic. You can be better than what he made you. Yes, I can be better than him. Stronger, more powerful. Astarion grinned manically into Simon's shoulder, gripping a fistful of his shirt for emphasis. His eyes flicked up to meet Simon's for a moment, finding a mixture of concern and disapproval there. Oh, you meant be kinder, save orphans, pet bunnies, that sort of thing. Yes, I did rather mean that sort of thing, Simon replied. How many people did he need to use the father tone of voice with in this group? Astarion let out a scoffing giggle. I've no objection to being nice, you know. Once I have the power to bend others to my will, he said, his expression twisting into one of dark glee. Those with power have an obligation to protect those without, Simon said, reciting one of the lessons that had been drilled into him by his mother and tutors and governesses since he was old enough to walk. The lesson that kept the guillotines at bay, and ensured Fontdale's crown remained with the White Lily family, when so many other Dales had become weak-willed little representative democracies, whose noble titles were passed around like a prized toy, yours one week and his the next. "Do they now?" Astarion growled, leaning away from Simon a bit. "And when did that obligation start? Sometime in the last 2 centuries? Where were the powerful when I was enslaved? Beaten, given out like a party favor? I'll tell you, the powerful weren't the ones who freed me from Cazador. Mind flayers did." Simon found himself stunned for a moment, his blood rushing uncomfortably in his ears. All the other lessons he'd been taught rang in his mind. Don't tolerate such disrespect. Make him fear and obey you. Prove you're a White Lily boy. But there was no desire to act. For the second time in as many days, he felt ashamed. It had been some time since someone had made him feel this way. But shame was Simon's mother tongue. No matter how long he went without speaking it always came back fluently. His gaze fell away, but as Astarion continued to speak, his attention snapped back to him reflexively. "They gave me a gift too. The power to resist, the strength to take back my freedom. I'm embracing this power, and you should too," Astarion said, leaning close again and staring intently into Simon's eyes, the drunken glaze seeming to have cleared for a moment. Simon felt the twitch of the worm behind his eye, yearning to connect with Astarion's, to share intent, to share longing, to share potential. Almost shyly, Simon tuned his tadpole to Astarion's, the connection snapping into place like it had been made for them, wrapping willingly together. The image of a lover's embrace came to mind for half a second, tongues meeting in passion, the transponder nerves inside the nautiloid, tentacles entwining, his lord's embrace around him, inside him. I'll never go back. Think of all we could do with these worms if we can master them. I'll never go back. Look what we can already do. I'll never go back. Who could stop us? I'll never go back. I'll never go back. Astarion's thoughts were clear, even with the fear, the panic whispering beneath them. "I'm sorry, Astarion," Simon whispered. "I promise you that I will use my power to protect you. And I promise you, you'll never have to grovel again." Astarion could feel the trembling earnestness in Simon's words, his naivete almost embarrassing. But this was exactly what he'd hoped for, wasn't it? He pressed down on the worm, releasing his connection, and almost found himself missing it in the moment of silence that followed. Simon's mind rang with gentle, meditative tones, though they felt hollowed out, as though he were replaying them in his mind by rote, desperately running his fingers over the frayed edge of a prayer cloth until it unraveled completely and helped no one. And yet Simon had reached for him, had begun to wrap those frayed threads around him as they had connected. "How very romantic of you," Astarion chuckled, glancing down at how they had come together, hips pressed close, chest to chest. How eagerly Simon had stepped into his suggested embrace. Simon blinked, quickly releasing his hold on Astarion, letting go of the other man's waist. When had he put his arm around his waist? Oh, Lord! But not stepping away. "I merely meant... the Baron protects his people," he said hurriedly. "And you all are my people here. I didn't mean to imply anything prurient. Of course, Astarion toned, releasing Simon in return and sighing softly, indulging in the scent of willow he could always tease out of the man. Wouldn't want a certain someone to see us too close, he smirked, looking over at where Will slept by the fire before retreating. Come get me before the bloodbath starts. Wouldn't miss this Gith trial for the world. The slow stirrings of an early morning at camp were already beginning. No doubt Astarion's voice had carried. Karlak was slow to rise, but Simon glanced behind him to find Lae'zel already wide awake, her golden yellow eyes locked on him in a disapproving stare. Good morning, Simon said awkwardly. I was just...
Spare me, she rolled her eyes. Who you relieve tension with is not my concern, so long as it does not impede your function in the group.
Oh, no, we're not. Simon laughed uncomfortably, his ears burning as he wrestled with the tadpole, still trembling eagerly from the moments of contact it had, the way it was singing for its momentary partner and reaching out again for any nearby to grasp it, to share the caress of one mind against another.
You are embarrassed, Lae'zel observed, standing and rolling up her bedroll. Do not let that impede your function either.
Simon cleared his throat, looking away. We have bigger concerns this morning, he said, attempting to steer the conversation away from such fraught waters, before Will woke up.
Yes, we do, she replied. Your Faerun magistrate seems inebriate. I trust you to judge fairly. Do not make my trust misplaced, Lae'zel hissed, returning her bedroll to her tent and selecting a dagger for the morning's use.
Shadowheart marched proudly from her tent, still in her sleeping garb and dagger in hand.
Right here in the middle of camp. I love it,
she said. Right. Let's clear the space. No sense in getting blood on Karlak's bedroll. I'll retrieve the object of concern in today's trial. Can't we have coffee first? Gale sighed, a mage hand holding a tin carafe over the low morning fire. It would seem his efforts at delaying bloodshed were in vain from the murderous looks both Lae'zel and Shadowheart sent his way. I'll finish this over here, then. Are there enough witnesses to satisfy your legal requirements? Astarion asked through his open tent flap, reclined against his pile of dusty cushions.
Yes, even if we do not include the white, Lae'zel said, nodding toward where Withers sat at the edge of camp, still reading from his ever-lengthening scroll, but always giving the sense of being keenly observed.
"Oi, Withers, is that what you are?" Karlak called from her bedroll, casually tossing her pillow toward her tent with little regard for organization. The shriveled corpse turned his bloodshot eyes to the center of camp, an exhaustion in his expression normally reserved for elderly men frustrated with the antics of neighborhood children.
No.
Not a lich, not a mummy, and apparently two wrongs don't make a white, Gale grinned, having clearly been holding on to that pun for days. Karlak let out a snort of laughter, dumping her bedroll in a slightly singed pile in the middle of her open-sided tent. I never thought much about wizard humor. You're funny as shit, Gale. Karlak grinned back, crouching down next to him with a cup and awaiting coffee as well. Well, I was always told that women appreciate men who can make them laugh, Gale said, smiling a little sheepishly. Not only women, Simon added, his courtly giggle hidden behind the veil of his fingers.
When you're done charming everyone, Gale, Shadowheart called, tapping her toe, let's get this over with.
Right. Simon nodded, approaching the two women and looking between them. Neither had donned armor for this duel, speed being of utmost importance. Shadowheart wore her more casual but still functional clothing, and Lae'zel her not casual at all under-armor gear, its many latch points meant to secure her armor as close to the skin as possible. Both had selected daggers which made statements, Lae'zel favoring one which appeared ceremonial and decorative, Shadowheart an efficient and slender blade. The terms of this trial are that you will fight until first blood is drawn, Whoever draws first blood will be considered the winner and will be given custody of this Gith relic, Simon stated, holding the heavy object up for examination. Either participant may withdraw from combat at any time and forfeit the trial. Are these terms both correct and agreeable?
Affirmative,
Lae'zel stated, her gaze flicking between Simon and Shadowheart, and her grasp on her dagger tight, anxious to begin.
Yes, let's get on with it,
Shadowheart said. Her expression was one of smug satisfaction, as if she'd already won the duel and was merely carrying on formalities. Simon tried his best not to anticipate the outcome. He was, in fact, interested in being a fair arbiter. He stepped back, hesitating for a moment. Would Lae'zel surrender? Or would she take the opportunity to exact a little revenge for the night before first? Begin. Neither woman lunged into action as most of the spectators expected. Neither woman took any of the expected actions in a duel. Almost disgusted with herself, Lae'zel tossed her dagger into the dirt and drew breath to say those hated words. She could do that. She could say, I forfeit. She just had to say it. She opened her mouth to speak when the flash of steel in the morning light caught her eye. Shadowheart had drawn her dagger across her palm, blood dripping to the dirt as she held her hand aloft like a prize.
I've drawn first blood, she declared, grinning wickedly. I claim victory.
You! That is not the terms! Lae'zel spat, regretting having motioned to forfeit so quickly. The terms did only say whoever draws first blood. No specification about whose blood was to be drawn. Astarion grinned, his eyes glittering with malicious glee. By the terms of the duel, Shadowheart is the victor.
Silence, Caneyank!
Lae'zel spat, the venom in her words palpable. Not only that, but, Lae'zel, you threw down your blade. You forfeited, Simon declared, keeping his tone delicate.
Under your advisement, treacherous bastard!
Lae'zel snarled. A chill crept through the air as Simon's head whipped in Lae'zel's direction, a fury in his eyes that none had seen. The morning mist crystallized into frost around his feet as he took 3 strides, rime building along her discarded blade and creeping up the sides of his boots. He loomed into her space, his cold fury meeting her hot rage as they stood nose to nose. You are rightfully upset at this turn, and you do not know me. That is the only reason I am not punishing you for your insolence. I'm going to make one thing perfectly clear. Simon growled, his tone a deathly whisper and his teeth bared just as much as hers. You may create whatever insults you wish for me, it matters not, but for one. You may not call me a bastard, he declared, the dark ring of an unholy proclamation in his voice. This is your only warning. Kitty's got claws, Karlach remarked, leaning down to murmur to Will. Lae'zel's lip curled in a snarl, and she lashed out with her clenched fist, sending Simon reeling back a few paces as her punch rattled through his frail body. Understood. And now I've found honor, Lae'zel growled in Simon's direction.
Here, give me the artifact and I'll take care of that busted lip,
Shadowheart replied, smugly approaching. I do suppose I deserve that, taking that tone with someone not under my command, Simon remarked, his tone a marked change from the cold threats from before. He gingerly touched his jaw and lip, a little smear of blood coming away.
Oh, hush, and hand it over. It's been out of my possession for too long as it is,
Shadowheart said, holding her hand out. Sighing, Simon set the artifact down in her hand, welcome to be rid of the thing.
There. Now let's...
The relic shone and vibrated in Shadowheart's hand for a moment and flung itself back into Simon's grasp, his hand barely rising in time to catch it. Stunned silence reigned for a moment before Simon reached out again. Take it, he said. As Shadowheart's hand neared it, he could feel it begin to pulse as if alive, and as soon as it left his hand and touched hers, it once again flew to his chest as if thrown.
What in the hell's... Simon! Shadowheart spat. Give it back!
Perhaps if you'd earned it honorably, it would permit you to hold it.
Lae'zel fired, smirking and holding her hand out.
It is time to return it to its rightful place. Now that I've drawn blood, she added.
She reached to take the artifact from Simon's hand, a motion Simon allowed out of sheer curiosity. Just as before, as soon as it was out of Simon's grasp, it flashed and leaped back towards him.
Tsva! It belongs with my people,
Lae'zel snapped.
Unhand it!
Lae'zel, I'm not withholding it, I promise, Simon said. He dropped the object on the ground, whereupon it immediately rebounded into his hands. Seems like it's bound itself to you. Be wary of that sort of thing, Will advised. Why me? Shadowheart had it much longer than I did, and Lae'zel's Githyanki. I'm just...
Skinva!
Lae'zel growled.
You are just as duplicitous as her!
Lae'zel, I promise you, on my honor as Baron Fontdale.
Save your oaths! We are going to find the creche now, and once we are purified, we are through!
She snarled, rage burning in her eyes as she stalked back to her tent.
When I see your backs for the last time, it will not be soon enough.
Lae'zel! Damn it. Simon sighed, starting after her.
Let her go. Surely we'd be better off both without her and without worms in our brains, Shadowheart remarked.
No, everyone in this group has a purpose, has value they bring, Simon insisted, frowning at Shadowheart. Lae'zel is no different. At the very least, though, if we let her go now, she'll just come back with more gift to hunt us down and take that artifact off our cold, dead corpses, Gale added. I don't know if she's got a good side, but we should endeavour to stay on her side. Simon looked down at the relic in his hands, glowing with intent. Wars have been fought over less, and he had no intention of going to war. Not yet. Not against Lae'zel.